Good evening to all of you. Welcome back to the digital platform of Sadhan Chandra Mahavidyalaya. I'm here. I'm back with the session 4 of the special lecture series being conducted by Department of English, Sadhan Chandra Mahavidyalaya. I, Gautam Maji, an assistant professor as well as head of Department of English. I'm back with the session 4. In this session, this is an international session. In this session, we are fortunate to have our very special guest from University of Dhaka. She is Professor Rebecca Haque, and apart from Rebecca Haque, we are fortunate to have our honorable principal sir with us. So before introducing our principal sir and our very guest speaker to you, so let's find the introduction of our guest speaker. She is Professor Rebecca Haque, Department of English, University of Dhaka. She is very renowned scholar across the globe. Rebecca Haque is a professor and the former chair 2009 to 12 Department of English, University of Dhaka. She is also a poet, writer, and translator affiliated with the New York Writers Workshop (NYWW) and Asia Pacific Writers and Translators (APWT). As an
Sir, 2
academic, her
minutes, 2
literary
minutes,
criticism
2
mainly
3
uses
minutes.
the theoretical
এখন
framework
বলে
and
দেবো
methodology
সাউন্ড করলে
of
সাউন্ড করলে
psychoanalytic criticism. Her recent areas of research and publication are cultural studies, film studies, and South Asian literature. She received a gold medal for distinction in MA in literature, University of Dhaka in the year 1980, a certificate of distinction as a resident scholar at UCLA and Vanderbilt, USA, for a summer course on 20th century American interdisciplinary studies 1995. She was Caleb Scholar at Dalhousie, EU, Halifax, Nova Scotia, Canada, 1990-1991. Her published books are Commencement, Poems, and Occasional Essays, 2003, published and reprinted 2009. Women Gender Literature in the year 2003 it was published. And Hemingway Centenary Tribute, co-edited in the year 2007. Rebecca Haque also writes OPED and creative non-fiction essays for the Daily Star newspaper, Dhaka. So we are fortunate to have this great scholar amongst us. So before physically uh, bring her before you, I would like to introduce our honorable principal sir before you, and we would like to have few words from our honorable principal sir. So I'd like to request our honorable principal sir, Dr. Asif Hawk. So sir, could you have few words for us and few words for the viewers who are watching us live right now? Sir, please.
okay. Good evening and welcome to all of you in this important session. As you know, the Department of English Sadhan Chandra Mahavidyalaya under the leadership of Gautam Maji, assistant professor and head of the department, and in a series of lecture has arranged to share knowledge of eminent resource persons, scholars of English language and literature to our students and also the other students, scholars, and faculty members of different institutes. Today is the fourth lecture. Professor Rebecca Haque, Department of English, University of Dhaka, has given consent to spare her valuable time as a speaker for this session. She will speak on Dorothy and William Wordsworth, Mutual Dependency. I wish to thank Professor Haque for accepting our invitation on behalf of our college. Online mode of higher education is an important tool for exchanging knowledge this this loneliness, anxiety, tension, etc. to some extent in this crisis period. Hope Dr. Hawke will fulfill our expectations and session after all will be interactive and helpful to all participants. Thanks a lot to all of you. Be safe and keep safe in this pandemic crisis period. Thank you. Gautam, please go
Thank you very
ahead the
much, sir,
session.
for thank you very much, sir, for your valuable words. Now, for whom we have been waiting for a long time, so I'd like to bring her on the screen. So, ma'am, welcome on the digital platform of Sadhan Chandra Mahavidyalaya. And before
Thank
you
you.
commence delivering your lecture, I would like to share my personal experience while talking to her. She's very, not only very scholarly person, but very uh, good to every person. It's not that that kind of person is usually find. So, welcome, ma'am, once again to our digital platform. And I have already introduced you and your works, and we are really fortunate to have you in our session 4. So, before beginning the session, I need to tell to all the viewers who are watching us live right now, if you have any question, don't think that you can't ask. You can ask her. So do drop your question in the comment box, and just after her lecture, we will get back to her with your questions. So do drop your questions, and after the session, that means after our lecture, we will come back to her with your questions. So do drop, and I would like to welcome once again our honorable guest, Rebecca Hawke. Ma'am, please, now this session is yours.
Thank you. Good evening, and thank you for this opportunity. Uh, my lecture, I would like to take this off. I'm not used to this. I hope if anybody has a question, can ping me and I'll put this on. Uh, Now, I am going to talk about the relationship between Dorothy and her very famous brother, William Wordsworth. Now, as a preamble, I just want to say that when I was a student studying romantic poetry, Dorothy was marginalized, was not in my focus as a person, as a writer. And when I became a lecturer in 1980, for 4 years, I taught all the romantic poets, Blake, Wordsworth, and Keats, Shelley, Byron. Even then, when I was teaching William's work, I was teaching the Prelude and all his poetry. Dorothy was not in my thoughts. It was later when I went to Canada and did graduate work as a film scholar that I did a full year course with Professor Janet Thompson, who did her PhD at University of Toronto. And I did a full year course with her, and the title of the course was William Wordsworth, Samuel Coleridge, Taylor Coleridge, and Dorothy Wordsworth in Conversation. Now, part of the course was looking at those three friends, and the last part of the course, about 6 months, we concentrated totally on Dorothy, her life, her writings, and especially her journals, the Alfoxden Journal and the Grasmere Journal. So I have a lot of material, and I have immersed myself into Dorothy. And from 1980 onwards, when I first started women's studies seriously, I began to understand her state of mind. And the theorists who influenced me were, of course, the first wave of feminist writers who talked about literature feminism, like Sisu and the Romantic Imagination, Mayor Spatz. And my natural methodology became psychoanalytic theory. And one book, one author who really influenced my approach to Dorothy, my approach to women's fiction and serious study of women's literature, poetry, is Carol Gilligan. Her landmark study, in a different voice, she talks about women who have considered themselves, who see themselves primarily as caregivers, who see themselves, their position, their status, as their selfhood always in a relationship, unlike men who have more aggressive individual viewpoints attached to I, themselves. Women always see themselves in a relationship with others, and they take the responsibility as nurturer and caregivers. So this is her argument. And reading all this literature about women and the theories and the studies of women's minds, imagination, how they work, this has influenced me. Another book, landmark study, which influenced me is, of course, Tilly Olson's Silences, where she has talked about how women are silenced, the natural creativity, the work they have to do as mates, as nurturers, housewife, carers. And another book which influenced me and which you can use as resource material, it really deals with women's fiction, because I have seriously worked on women's fiction novels, 18th century, 19th century. The other book which influenced me, which you can use to understand the language, the imagery, the archetypal metaphors that women naturally use, is Archetypal Patterns in Women's Literature by Anna Spratt. This is also a seminal study and is a good book to understand the motifs, the archetypal images, the metaphors that women use. So with that introduction, I will begin my lecture. And here I have talked about, especially focused on William and Dorothy. And if in future we have more scope and time for another session, I can talk about especially the life of Dorothy. And one good book which you can read about Dorothy is a fairly recent biography by Frances Hinton, which came out in England. That biography is a good one to start with, to understand. So, Mutual Dependency, William and Dorothy Wordsworth. Orphaned at an early age and separated for many years in their childhood by circumstances beyond their control, William and Dorothy clung to each other in their adult years. Their strong attachment to each other manifested itself in a yearning for an intimate, nurturing family life together. And in their prose and poetical writing, both brother and sister have paid tribute to their mutual love and devotion. Now, I just want to interject here. There has been a great amount of research and publication surrounding the relationship between William and Dorothy, starting in the 70s, 80s, 90s. And some critics have tried to put a kind of pernicious, incestuous shade to the relationship, which it was not. I want to make that clear. More than William, however, it was Dorothy who longed to set up house with her brother. From the age of 6, she had been shunted back and forth among various distant relatives, and as she grew older, she constantly dreamt of the day when she would be able to live once again with William and her other brothers. In a long letter written to her friend Jane Pollard in 1793, Dorothy's dream of life is clothed in warm and homey images of a stable, secure, and mutually fulfilling future. In addition, the letter contains a poignant confession of regret at the enforced separation of the siblings and an unequivocal affirmation of the ties that united them. Dorothy writes, quote, I have laid the particular scheme of happiness for each season. When I think of winter, I hasten to furnish our little parlor. I chose the shutters, set out the tea table, brighten the fire. When our refreshment is ended, I produce our work. and William brings his book to our table and contributes at once to our instruction and amusement. And at intervals, we lay aside the book and each hazard our observations upon what has been read without the fear of ridicule or censure. We talk over past days. We do not sigh for any pleasures beyond our humble habitation. The central point of all our joys, O Jane, with such romantic dreams as these, I amuse my fancy during many an hour which would otherwise pass heavily along. Of course, as is well known, it was Raisley Calvert's timely and fortuitous gift of a legacy to the aspiring poet in 1795, which provided the wherewithal that enabled William and Dorothy to set up house together for the first time. The legacy proved to be a godsend both in the wide world of literature and in the smaller private world of the two Wordsworths. Freedom from the unsettling anxiety of financial insecurity, and the presence of a devoted sister who took over the responsibility of running the routine household affairs gave William the time and the confidence to become the great poet that he was destined to be. Dorothy was not only a frugal and adept housekeeper, she was also William's cherished friend and companion. Moreover, in her role as homemaker and nurturer, from the first days of living together at Racedown till his marriage to Mary Hutchinson in 1802, Dorothy became a surrogate mother for the poet and eventually came to be associated by him with the sublime, spiritual, feminine principle in nature. Thus, while she herself, while she was herself emotionally and economically dependent on William, her presence and her personality were soon beginning to have a profound impact upon her brother's creative imagination. As Richard Fadem, an early critic, pointed out, Dorothy played in her dependent capacity an instrumental role in helping to create Wordsworth the poet, certainly the poet he came to be. Fadem writes, William both loved and needed his sister. However, his attitude towards her in his poetry is not always one of unequivocal affection and adulation. Although in his major autobiographical poems, noticeably in Tintern Abbey and The Prelude, he celebrated her as a restorative and curative force in his creative life, he is more ambivalent in the Lucy poems. Another critic points out, Richard Matlock, that the relationship of William and Dorothy was not exempt from normal strains. He writes, Matlock says, Wordsworth's relationship with Dorothy was probably stifling and inhibitive at the time of the Lucy poem's composition. During this extremely intense and concentrated period, the period between October 1798 and February 1799, when Wordsworth was writing so much of importance in addition to the Lucy poems, the Matthew poems, Lucy Gray, most of part one of the Prelude, together with its associated passages, Nutting, There Was a Boy. The poet's relationship with Dorothy and Coleridge figured prominently in the psychobiographical context of his work. Wordsworth was depressed at Goslar, mainly because he was separated from Coleridge and was growing uneasy about the constancy of Coleridge's friendship and devotion. Dorothy could hardly be of comfort in this situation because it was the added cost of keeping her that prevented Wordsworth from joining Coleridge, first in Ratzeburg and later in the expensive university town of Gottingen. The consequence of Wordsworth's depression for his work was the fantasy of Dorothy's death in the Lucy poems. Unquote. Now, Apart from the kind of ambivalence recorded in the Lucy poems, Wordsworth was generally very grateful for Dorothy's constant companionship. He may have felt somewhat stifled and inhibited during his trips abroad with his sister, but for the most part, he is unequivocal in declaring that he considered his relationship with her to be artistically restorative and generative. For example, and we know this, most of us have studied this in school, Tintern Abbey. For example, in Tintern Abbey, which prefigures the prelude in both style and subject matter, the poet is especially appreciative of Dorothy's spontaneity and her ability to respond to nature with the innocence and wonder of a child. Her presence, in fact, bestows within the poet his earlier lost self and the reflection of his former self in Dorothy's instinctive animal response to nature helps him reaffirm his faith in himself and his art. I quote those famous lines from Tintern Abbey. He says, "Thou art with me here upon the banks of this fair river, thou my dearest friend, my dear, dear friend, and in thy voice I catch the language of my former art, and read my former pleasures in the shooting lights of thy wild eyes. Oh, yet a little while may I behold in thee what I was once, my dear, dear sister." The double emphasis on the word dear underlines the intensity of the emotion felt by Wordsworth, and it serves to accentuate his overwhelming gratitude for Dorothy's beneficent influence at a critical juncture in his journey towards self-discovery. Of course, Wordsworth's fullest expression of gratitude for his sister's soothing and healing presence is to be found in his autobiographical epic, The Prelude. In Book 6, titled Cambridge and the Alps, Wordsworth confesses to Coleridge his immense delight at the reunion with his sister in the summer of 1787. In the following passage, which I'll read, the poet is not only celebrating Dorothy's active participation in his life, he is also celebrating the opportunity to share his innermost thoughts. This is from Prelude, and of course, Prelude is also iambic pentameter, contemplative, meditative verse, run-on lines, beautiful, sublime poetry. He tried to imitate the grandeur of Miltonic sublimity. And he writes in Cambridge or in the Alps that he can share his inner thoughts with a person who loved and appreciated him. And in addition, the young poet's joyous discovery of the beauteous face of nature is made more wonderful by the knowledge that his sister finds as great a pleasure in nature as he does. So these are the lines. He says, "In summer among distant nooks I roved, Dovedale or Yorkshire dales, or through by-tracks of my own native region, and was blessed between those sundry wanderings with a joy above all joys, that seemed another morn risen on mid-noon. The presence, friend, I mean, of that sole sister, now after the separation desolate, restored to me such absence that she seemed a gift then first bestowed. My sister and myself, when having climbed in danger through some window's open space, we looked abroad, or on the turret's head lay listening to the wildflowers and the grass as they gave out their whispers to the wind." In Book 10, Residence in France, Wordsworth acknowledges the fact that it is Dorothy's love and devotion which helps him to recover from the disillusionment and despair he had felt in the years following the French Revolution. The confused and troubling events of the period between 1792 and 95, which included, among other things, the rise of the tyrannical Robespierre, the reign of terror, and the war between England and France, had shattered his idealistic vision of a new egalitarian society. Now, those of you who are undertaking serious study of Wordsworth, there's one very good book, Richard Honorato, which is a study of Wordsworth, the poet, growth of a poet. You could look at that book. That is a wonderful book I found very helpful. So during this period, Wordsworth was going through a lot of metaphysical, philosophical dilemma. And you remember also that he had an illegitimate daughter with Annette Vallon during this period. He had to leave them. He had to come back. He came back to England. And that is another episode. It has to do entirely with Wordsworth as a person, as an individual. But here, we have to remember the background where Wordsworth is considering the more international ramifications of what followed the French Revolution. So this war between England and France had shattered his idealistic vision of a new egalitarian society. Furthermore, Godwinian rationalism had not only failed to provide solace, it had led to the paralysis of his creative life. It was at this time, in September 1795, that Wordsworth and Dorothy moved into Racedown House in Dorset, and it is here that Wordsworth's recovery and his discovery of renewed poetic vigor are brought about in the company of the dedicated and loyal Dorothy. As in Tintern Abbey, the mere presence of his passionate and vivacious sister enables the poet to imaginatively recapture his past and thus connect once again with nature. I quote a few lines from Book 10. The beloved woman in whose sight those days were past maintained for me a saving intercourse with my true self. For I, though impaired and changed much, as it seemed, I was no further changed than as a clouded, not a waning moon. She, in the midst of all, preserved me still, a poet, made me seek beneath that name my office upon earth and nowhere else. The conclusion of the prelude contains a long lyrical eulogy of Dorothy. In this verse tribute, Wordsworth tells us to what extent he had been dependent on his sister for his own emotional and imaginative growth. Once again, Wordsworth refers to the fact that Dorothy's natural, vital, and reassuring presence sustains his own faith in his vocation. In moments of crises in his poetic life, she had helped him return to the earlier stage of harmonious interaction with nature, and he eulogizes her as a soulmate, a friend, and guide who illuminates the dark days of despair with her purity and an unconscious understanding of the laws of things and life of nature. This is what Wordsworth says. Child of my parents, sister of my soul, elsewhere have strains of gratitude been breathed to thee for all the early tenderness which I from thee imbibed. And true it is that later seasons owed to thee no less. I too exclusively esteemed that love and sought that beauty which, as Milton sings, hath terror in it. Thou didst soften down this oversternness, but for thee, sweet friend, my soul, too reckless of mild grace, had been far longer what by nature it was framed, longer retained its countenance severe, but thou didst plant its crevices with flowers, hang it with shrubs that twinkle in the breeze, and teach the little birds to build their nests and warble in its chambers. At a time when nature, destined to remain so long foremost in my affections, had fallen back into second place. Although we are left in no doubt as to the nature of the bond between brother and sister. Wordsworth's portrait of Dorothy at times nevertheless seems to relegate the self-effacing, devoted sister to the background, while it is the image of the poetic genius which is foregrounded for the benefit of Coleridge and future readers of the prelude. At the narrative center of the prelude is the articulate, visible, and self conscious poet who is Wordsworth. And despite the strains of gratitude in which Dorothy is apotheosized in the poem, she remains a floating and ephemeral figure on the periphery of our vision. We get a sense of Dorothy's selfless involvement in areas of experience which were crucial to the poet himself, but it is difficult to see her as a separate and unique individual since Wordsworth fails to probe deeper into her character and personality. Now, Elizabeth Hardwick has one early, very well known book titled Seduction and Betrayal. There is a chapter on Dorothy Wordsworth, which is very influential. And she says that Wordsworth ignores what we imagine Dorothy must have been like, must have often felt, undefined, attendant, dangerously emotional, stumbling. All this side of her life is a hole, a vacancy. Now, it has been the task of feminist writers, women writers, researchers since the 70s to try to understand, to fill that hole, to make Dorothy a person, a creative person, understand her. And it has become a cautionary tale of what can become of a woman. Her sad, tragic ending is a cautionary tale. Indeed, for many years, literary historians and critics had taken their cue from Wordsworth's verse and persisted in seeing Dorothy only as William's satellite. It is only recently that a place in literary history has been evaluated in terms other than her existence as a famous poet's sister. Today, on the strength of her own writings, Dorothy is considered a distinctive writer whose diaries and journals are worthy of critical attention for their innate formal and contextual merits. One diary in particular, the Grasmere Journal, has been the object of concentrated scrutiny not only because of the detailed descriptions of nature and the daily household activities, but also because it is here that Dorothy reveals more about herself and her relationship with her brother than she does in all her other works put together. In 1799, Dorothy and William moved to the Lake Country village of Grasmere, and at one of Wordsworth's frequent trips away from home, Dorothy's loneliness acts as a catalyst in making her begin to write her prose autobiography. She writes, I resolved to write a journal of the time till William and John, her other brother, return. And I set about keeping my resolve because I will not quarrel with myself and because I shall give William pleasure by it when he comes home again. Now, the Grasmere Journal is not a true autobiography. Unlike Wordsworth's poetic autobiography, The Prelude, which takes us on a journey from infancy to maturity, and in which there is a great deal of introspective self-analysis as the poet struggles to achieve a stable poetic identity. The Grasmere Journal contains detailed accounts of only the period 1800 to 1803. And much of the work is repetitive and concerned with external activities, walking all over the beautiful countryside alone or in William's company, gardening, toiling with her brother to grow flowers and vegetables, and doing the back-breaking household chores that had to be done by women alone, such as laundering, ironing, cleaning and cooking. Now in the Grasmere Journal, you have page after page describing the laborious, back-breaking work of doing laundry, washing the white linen, the sheets, and boiling them, washing them every week. And Wordsworth had a large family. There, Mary Hutchinson, they had many children, and it was Dorothy who was doing this. And she has the passages where she suffers from headaches and she's falling ill with all the housework. So it is very painful to read many parts of the Grasmere Journal. So you have these activities described. Dorothy is meticulous in her descriptions of people, and her observation of nature is at times so accurate and poetic that both Wordsworth and Coleridge transposed some of their graphic natural images into their own poems. However, Dorothy avoids introspection in her writing, and just as the brother had provided little of Dorothy's real self in the prelude, the sister herself in turn desists from looking inward and revealing her innermost desires and fears. Dorothy observes the world around her and records her feelings at particular moments in time, but she does not analyze or examine either her own motives and passions or those of others. It is possible that there is a good psychological reason for Dorothy's refusal to be more critical and analytic. The traumatic childhood experiences of loss and homelessness probably led to the fear of being too bold and independent even in her writing. Although Dorothy's inner life is absent in the journals, there are many passages which betray the intensity of her feelings for her brother William. His presence kept her alive and vital, and his absence made her suffer. A whole series of entries at the beginning of the Grasmere Journal, written during William's absence from home from the period between May 1800 to June 1800, shows us an anxious, lonely, insecure Dorothy whose tense expectancy of her brother's return is manifested in the physical symptoms of constant headaches. Even nature does not soothe her at these times. I quote a few lines. She says, "I sat a long time upon a stone at the margin of the lake, and after a flood of tears, my heart was easier. The lake looked to me, I knew not why, dull and melancholy, and the weltering on the shores seemed a heavy sound. No letters, no papers. I was sadly tired, ate a hasty dinner, and had a bad headache." Again, another entry. "Wrote to William after dinner, nailed up the beds, worked in the garden, sat in the evening under the trees. I went to bed soon with a bad headache. I expected a letter from William. I had a bad headache, went to bed after dinner, and lay till after 5, not well after tea. No letter, no William. I lingered out of doors in the hope of hearing my brother's tread. No William. I slackened my pace as I came near home, fearing to hear he was not come." The need for William's physical nearness is so pronounced that it leads us to speculate that Dorothy must have had an unconscious terror of losing him, as she has lost her mother and father at the early age of 6. His presence is constantly desired because his presence alone gives her a sense of security and permanence. In his absence, all her thoughts focus on him with an urgency akin to hysteria, and she is constantly concerned with his safety when he is traveling. Another entry, she tries to concentrate on her work and forget the separation anxiety which is killing her. She says, "I will be busy, I will look well and be well fed. when he comes back to me, oh, the darling, here is one of his bitten apples. I can hardly find in my heart to throw it into the fire. Sat down where we always sit. I was full of thoughts about my darling, blessings on him. And then she writes, when he, I'm sorry, I'll just skip this. Wordsworth marries Mary Hutchinson on October 4th, 1802. And soon after this event, Dorothy stops writing in her journal. Although Dorothy accompanies the newlyweds on their honeymoon, she does not attend the wedding ceremony. Her description of her own emotional state during the time William was being wedded to another woman reveals a great deal about her inner conflicts. She's numb with grief at the thought of losing William to Mary, losing William's affection and attention. This is the entry. And this is the one entry where she had the wedding ring. She put it on her finger. She took it off, gave it to, and this is the one instance where this wretched woman was, mad with grief about where her future lies, what will her condition be after William's marriage. This is the one episode which some critics have taken out of context and a lot of hullabaloo about some kind of scandalous relationship with Wordsworth. So she's the entry. I saw them go down the avenue towards the church. William had parted from me upstairs. I gave him the wedding ring with how deep a blessing. I took it from my forefinger where I had worn it the whole of the night before. He slipped it again onto my finger and blessed me fervently. I kept myself as quiet as I could, but when I saw the two men running up the walk, coming to tell me it was over, I could stand it no longer and threw myself on the bed where I lay in stillness, neither hearing or seeing anything, till Sarah, which is Mary's sister, came upstairs to me and then said, "They're coming." This forced me from the bed where I lay, and I moved, I knew not how, straight forward, faster than my strength could carry me, till I met my beloved William and fell upon his bosom. After reading this passage, we come to realize that Dorothy must have steeled herself to accept the situation with grace and courage. After all, unless she is able to subsume her own wishes to the wishes of her brother, her very survival is put at risk. Now, she didn't have a suitor. She couldn't get married because she had no fortune of her own, no money, no independent income, which, if you know, you've read Jane Austen and all the other Charlotte Bronte, women without any income. And because Dorothy had no income, and we have one picture of her in midlife, and we don't know what she looked like, but we know that she had vivaciousness. Her eyes in a young age. She loved nature. She was sentient. She was full of life. But she was plain looking. So she had neither fortune nor beauty to offer. So she remained unmarried. Her maternal instinct was thwarted. She had no home of her own. And the rest of her life, she toiled as a domestic servant. And that led to her mental breakdown. And at the end of her life, she was mad. She had dementia. She was mad. Her life was pitiful. So Norman Fruman, in one important essay in the Times Literary Supplement in 1985, titled The Sister's Sacrifice, this is what Fruman points out, that from this time onward, after Wordsworth married Mary, began to have children in the full household, from this time onward, until her mind, Dorothy's mind and body, broke down in her early 60s. She was a tireless servant of William's needs and those of his household. And finally, my conclusion. It is a tragic irony that Dorothy never found a lover or husband. Her mind began to disintegrate as she entered midlife. Routine chores and constant hard work was her lot in Wordsworth's household. Motherhood was denied her. In such circumstances, even nature gradually failed to sustain her or give her any solace. Thank you. Now, I'll put on my earphones, hear your questions, or see the writings. Over to you, Gautam, Professor
Yes,
Gautam
thank
Maji.
you. Thank you very much, ma'am, for your insightful lecture. And really, we are enriched of your with your lecture. We have basically got only one question I have, uh, and most of the wishes we have received for you and for the organizers of this special lecture series. Thank you very much for all of you who have wished and as well as you have congratulated and best wishes conveyed for ma'am. So we have only one question. So I'm just taking this question on your screen so you can find it.
Okay.
Hope you get that
Yes.
question.
Madam, can it be said that Wordsworth used Dorothy's imaginative power, her approaches towards her life, and her fear of losing him despite Wordsworth's appreciation of her in his poems? And isn't it right that being a woman, she was underprivileged and that defended her from being a great writer of them? Exactly. This is more than a question. This is a kind of a summary of what my argument is. Now, you can write a PhD thesis. So much has been written and can still be written about Dorothy. Of course, our from a woman's point of view, that is the crux of our argument that Wordsworth did not really allow her to blossom and she faded into the background. And there are theses where we see Wordsworth, I personally see Wordsworth as a very negligent brother after his marriage. And she was relegated, as I pointed out, to the role of a servant because they could not have run the household without Dorothy. And you have, this is the peak of Wordsworth's fame, and we have found, we can say that he has been exploitative. And he had, in her youth, she had inspired Coleridge and Wordsworth. So much of what she had written, the descriptions of nature from, especially in the Alfroxton Journal, had been taken, the imagery had been absolutely lifted from her journal and put into his poems. Coleridge had borrowed some of the images, but Wordsworth had practically lifted many of the words, the imagery, the description, absolutely whole and put into his poems. So there she was the catalyst, and they used to read together. She used to read out her descriptions of nature she had written while she was walking that beautiful lake district and countryside. And walking was a great literary fashion in those, and the grand tour, going to Europe, going on long walks across the moors, across the Cumberland district. She would put down these descriptions and she would read to them, to Coleridge and Wordsworth by the fireside, and they would absorb this and they would be inspired. The spark of creativity would be in them because of the fire in Dorothy's soul and heart. Her creativity inspired them. So all this happened when she was young. Later, she toiled and worked and hard, and she lost her will to live. She lost that wildfire in the eyes because everything was dull, everything was drudgery, washing and cooking and laundering. And how can a woman burdened is she became a workhorse, and that is the tragedy, and that is how it led to her breakdown, mental breakdown. And yes, it is a kind of the question itself, that the answer lies within the question, that you have said, that is the focus of the entire argument between the relationship. And as I said, Carol Gilligan, who in this book of 1982, it was one of the first to differentiate between women and men, women's thinking, men's thinking, women, how they see themselves and not only society, not only patriarchy has relegated them, but how women had been conditioned to see themselves in relation always to a male, and in a secondary position, submissive, and but as she grows into adolescence, the woman is important because in her consciousness, she sees herself as a carer, always in relation to an adult, to children, to adult male, to a household, where she takes her responsibility as a carer, as a nurturer, very seriously. And in Dorothy's case, because she had no other resources, external, physical, other, and because all that work overpowered her creativity and silenced her. Some women are able to sort of split themselves and grow self-esteem and still write and find time to organize, like Virginia Woolf's famous, you must have a room of your own, not only in income. So Dorothy was one of the first whose work was taken to be a warning. This shall not happen anymore to women. They will find voice, they will find space, they will find a room, and they will have an income. And that is the impetus for the entire women's drive for vote, for independence, autonomy, and whatever you have. You must have free will. Even if you choose to be somebody's carer, somebody's partner, you must have a space and time to give expression to your creativity in whatever form. Otherwise, it destroys you. Okay.
Thank you, ma'am, for your answer. So we have another, not exactly question,
Okay.
but it has come from, hope you can read it out on your screen.
Yes, this is Debojyoti. I hope I pronounced it de.
Yeah, Debojyoti De, Debojyoti De, yes,
I don't
correct.
know where. Okay, ma'am. So Dorothy Wordsworth serves as an inspiration behind all Williams' works. Not really all, but she was there as a kind of a lodestar, if you like, when they were growing up. She was there. Now, if I may sort of take you to a different genre, Tennessee Williams, Laura. All of us have read Glass Menagerie. Now, there, that is also based on life story, autobiography. Tom and his sister, who was disabled, and Tennessee Williams' sister was also in life. She was handicapped, and he was very close to his sister. And her tragedy, her inability to fully be functional. She later was lobotomized. She was diagnosed as schizophrenic, and all that is in dramatic form in the Glass Menagerie. Tennessee Williams felt responsible and was wound this wound he carried about being unable to help his sister. It all is there in that play, and throughout his life, his attempt to run away, to escape into movies, to try to go abroad, was only his attempt to try to forget the tragedy of his sister's life. So brother sister, especially when the sister Wordsworth was so much younger, she saw Wordsworth not only as a brother, but being an infant, she saw him as a protector, father figure. And Wordsworth had this special bond. He had other brothers who went abroad, who died, but this bond between Dorothy and Wordsworth was also fundamental, because Wordsworth could see in Dorothy the kind of reaction he wanted. or he wanted to live and find once again in nature through the influence of nature on his poetic sensibility, which he had when he was a young boy running along the river Derwent. So yes, she inspired him when she was reading, and when he could see the fire in her eyes, the wild fire of being so intimate, one with nature. So that was it. But later on, of course, he went his own way. He became a more philosophical, more political writer. But then, towards the end of his days, Wordsworth in his later period was a non-entity. He wrote nothing. He wanted to finish his great magnum opus, The Excursion, The Recluse, which he was never able to. Yes. I hope that satisfies.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Okay, we have got another question. Also, this is
Mhm.
coming from Aisha Mukherjee. So I'm just taking the question on the screen so they can read it out.
Okay. Or you can, okay. Ma'am, Isha Mukherjee, why was she so afraid of losing her brother over his wife? Isn't it pretty normal to get married and settle at some point of his life? I mean, sister has her own place and the wife must have her own place. Okay. Now, here it is terror at losing the roof over her head. You remember, this is the 18th century, beginning of the 19th. This Dorothy Wordsworth has no income, no house or home or physical space of her own. She has not even 1 square foot of ground to her name. There is no possibility of going out to work unless she goes out to be somebody's child's governess or cook or a servant. There is no avenue to have a wage earning job unless in somebody's house. And in that time and place, she comes from a class where she cannot go out to beg. Many of Wordsworth's poems, The Ruined Cottage, for example, you have this time where there was great poverty. There was great poverty, and he describes, you have these beggars. You have letters of Dorothy where she talks and describes these beggars, these child beggars, these people who come to her door, and she gives them bread. She bakes. All week they have to bake. Every week they have to do laundry. They make their own bread. So she gives whatever she can from her own poultry store. So here, think of our own in our subcontinent. Our grandmothers, did they have any property of their own? Did they have any income of their own? So that there is no scope for her. She was afraid that once this is a natural reaction, it may be sort of irrational, but it is a natural fear, anticipation of what might, the worst case scenario. If Mary will not allow her to stay, if Mary abuses her, she knew her place, that her brother will not abandon her. But what will her position be? She will be a servant. She will have to physically work for her daily meal. She knew this. She could not go anywhere else. There was no one who would take her in. She had no friend. She had some friends she would write letters to, who would sort of offer some kind of mental assurance. Like Jane Pollard was a very good. They got married. They all went away. But because Wordsworth had not put away even 6 or 10 pounds for Dorothy as her own, that would enable her to say, okay, 10 pounds I put in a bank, I will get some interest for a daily bread, or somebody will come. And she did not have that. She was not out in society. She was not presented to anyone. There was no active role played by Mary or anybody else to introduce her to suitable men to get married. So what would she do? She had these fears of what the future might be. That is the situation.
Okay.
And when you
So,
say when Evizit Mukherjee, when you say isn't this natural? Yes, of course it is natural. And not only natural, sisters go out, try to find the best wife of, or try to have a good friend married off to the brother, of course. But here you have to understand that Dorothy, they knew Mary Hutchinson family from a long time. Even Coleridge was in love with Sarah Hutchinson, but fate led him to Sarah Fricker, which was a very unhappy marriage. And you have Dejection and Ode, that famous ode by Coleridge initially was addressed to Sarah Hutchinson, the sister of Mary he was so in love with. So here, but Dorothy at this stage had nothing. She was entering her, she was in her late 30s, 40s, and the helplessness, the terror was a natural response to being left with nothing.
thank you, ma'am, for your valuable answers. So, Anirban has replied to you also. Thank you very much, madam, for answering my questions. I'm very lucky to
Thank
attend this
you.
valuable live session. I'm also grateful to Gupta Mati sir. So, thank you, Anirban, for joining
Thank
us.
you, Anirban.
And as well
And
as
yes,
Anirban has also another message for you, looking for more such interesting lectures from you. So,
yes,
I hope that,
I'd be
ma'am,
delighted. Yes, and Professor Gautam Majhi,
thank you very
if
much.
these the participants and the students and the graduate students have further inquiry, they can email me. You can pass on my
Absolutely,
email,
definitely.
and I
Definitely.
can give them a bibliography. I can give them a list of other resource books and reference
Yes,
books.
definitely, I do. So as I find that there is no other question, so I would like to wrap up the session over here because just conveying my heartiest thanks to you because honestly speaking, you have given us so valuable time because you're very busy with your works, I know personally. So thank
This
you
is
very much,
this is
ma'am,
my
for
this is also my work. This is work. I'm delighted to have in lockdown and in this time of the pandemic, being
yes,
able to access your personalities, your visible space. It inspires me. It gives me something to look forward to. Makes me get up early in the morning. So thank you.
okay, okay. Thank you, ma'am, once again for your valuable time that you have given, and also you have agreed for this lecture. So I hope that next time also you will. Okay, also, okay, there is another, no, not
Okay.
this is the question.
Uh-huh.
I already,
Oh, she's thanking
Tashina,
you. Yes,
okay,
she's a student at Jagannath University in Dhaka. She's
okay, okay,
studying TESOL, I think, teaching English as a second, but she is very interested in literature also. She
okay,
cultivates and she's trying to develop her own library. So she
okay,
has
okay.
put
That's
thank
great,
you.
that's great. That's great. Tasina, I think I have properly
Yes,
pronounced her name.
yes,
Okay, so
Tahseen.
Tasina, for joining our session, thank you very much to all who have watched and who are watching and will watch it later. And once again, I would like to convey my heartfelt thanks to our honorable Rebecca ma'am because she is very busy, I know,
No
because
need
I
to call me
have had a
honorable. I'm not a, like a ambassador, but I hope I'm an ambassador from my country to you.
okay, okay. So, so thank you very much for joining us, and I hope that next time also if any kind of session will be there, and if I invite you, you would be there, and we would like to get your press selection next time too. So, on this particular note, I'd like to wrap up. But before wrapping up, I'd like to inform all of you who are watching me right now over here that I'm going to come on uh, third uh, third July, 3rd July at 7 p.m. And there will be another session 5. So if you would like to join, be there at 7 p.m. on 3rd July. So thank you very much, ma'am, once again,
Thank
and
you.
good night to you too,
Good night.
and to all the viewers who are watching us and who have been encouraging me and the entire department for organizing this kind of session. So,
Okay.
Tara, bye bye,
Thank you.
and ma'am, please
Thank you.
stay safe and stay healthy. Okay.
You too. Stay safe and
Thank you.
stay.
Thank you very much. Okay. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.